Jack had always considered himself a simple man. He didn't ask for much. A quiet life, a modest home, and a backyard where he could indulge his one true passion: plants. Not just any plants, mind you, but rare, exotic species that most people would mistake for weeds or alien invaders. To Jack, they were his children. His greenhouse was his sanctuary, his Eden, his fortress of solitude. But as fate would have it, Jack's peaceful existence was about to be bulldozed literally by the iron fist of suburban bureaucracy known as the HOA. The story begins on a crisp Monday morning, the kind of morning where the birds are chirping and the air smells faintly of optimism. Jack was kneeling in his greenhouse, gently misting his prized Nepenthes raja, a carnivorous plant so rare it could probably qualify for witness protection. Suddenly, the tranquility was shattered by the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. Jack looked up to see Karen. Yes, Karen, the archetype of HOA tyranny incarnate. She stood there with her clipboard and her smug smile that could curdle milk. "Jack," she began in a tone that implied she was about to ruin his week. "We need to talk about your greenhouse." Jack blinked at her, still clutching his spray bottle like it might ward off evil spirits. "What about it?" Karen sighed dramatically, as though explaining basic concepts to Jack was an exhausting chore she performed out of charity. "It's against HOA regulations." Jack frowned. "Regulations? It's just a greenhouse. It's not like I'm running an illegal nightclub." Karen's smile tightened. "It's an unapproved structure visible from the street." Jack glanced at the greenhouse, a modest construction tucked neatly into the corner of his backyard, and then back at Karen. "You mean barely visible? You'd need binoculars and a ladder to see it from the street." Karen didn't flinch. "Rules are rules," she said with the kind of self-righteousness that made Jack wonder if she moonlighted as a traffic cop. Jack tried reasoning with her. He explained how his greenhouse wasn't just some hobby. It was a vital part of his work as a botanist. He even offered to show her his research notes and rare plant specimens, hoping to appeal to some shred of humanity buried under her HOA-issued blazer. But Karen wasn't interested in science or rare plants or anything that didn't involve enforcing arbitrary rules with an iron fist. By Wednesday, Jack received an official notice from the HOA demanding he dismantle the greenhouse within 14 days or face fines so steep they could fund Karen's next vacation to Cabo. Jack was livid but determined to fight back. He spent hours combing through HOA bylaws, looking for loopholes or precedents that might save his beloved greenhouse. What he found instead was a labyrinth of legal jargon designed to crush the soul of anyone foolish enough to challenge HOA authority. "Fine," Jack muttered under his breath as he slammed shut the HOA handbook. "If they want war, they'll get war." But before Jack could launch his counteroffensive, disaster struck. On Friday morning, while Jack was at work teaching a botany class at the local community college, Karen orchestrated what could only be described as a suburban blitzkrieg. Armed with a demolition crew and what Jack suspected was an unhealthy amount of glee, Karen oversaw the destruction of his greenhouse without so much as a courtesy call. When Jack returned home that evening, he found his backyard in ruins. Broken glass, splintered wood, and crushed plants scattered like casualties on a battlefield. His Nepenthes raja lay limp and lifeless among the debris, its once majestic leaves now resembling soggy lettuce. Jack stood there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity before finally muttering, "Oh, it's on." Fueled by righteous fury and caffeine-fueled determination, Jack spent the weekend plotting his revenge. He wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to make Karen and her HOA cronies regret every smug smile and clipboard-wielding threat they had ever thrown his way. First, Jack filed a formal complaint against the HOA for unlawful destruction of property, a move that sent Karen scrambling for legal cover like a cockroach exposed to sunlight. Then he began compiling evidence of every minor infraction committed by HOA board members over the years. Unapproved garden gnomes in front yards, fences painted slightly off-regulation shades of beige, Christmas lights left up past January 15th. The list went on. But Jack didn't stop there. Using his expertise in botany and environmental science, he crafted an airtight case demonstrating how demolishing his greenhouse had caused irreparable harm not only to rare plant species but also to local biodiversity. He even enlisted the help of a few colleagues who were more than happy to testify as expert witnesses. By Monday morning, Karen found herself facing not just one angry botanist but an entire coalition of scientists armed with facts and PowerPoint presentations. The HOA scrambled to contain the fallout as news of Jack's crusade spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, or perhaps like invasive kudzu vines, a metaphor Jack found particularly satisfying. Homeowners who had long resented Karen's authoritarian rule began rallying behind Jack, turning what had started as a personal vendetta into a full-blown rebellion against HOA tyranny. Karen tried everything to regain control: threats, bribes, even hosting an emergency town hall meeting where she attempted to paint Jack as some sort of eco-terrorist hellbent on destroying suburban harmony. But her efforts only backfired spectacularly when one elderly resident stood up and declared loudly, "I'd rather have carnivorous plants next door than you, Karen." By Friday afternoon, Jack received word from his lawyer that the HOA had agreed to settle out of court. A victory so sweet it almost made up for losing his Nepenthes Raja. Almost. The settlement included not only financial compensation but also permission for Jack to rebuild his greenhouse without interference. As he stood in his backyard surveying the wreckage one last time before construction began anew, Jack couldn't help but smile. Sure, it had been a long week filled with stress and heartbreak, but it had also been undeniably satisfying watching Karen's empire crumble under the weight of her own hubris. And while revenge might not bring back crushed plants or shattered glass, it sure did feel good anyway. Jack's backyard had become a war zone, and he was the reluctant general. The HOA's demolition of his greenhouse was not just an attack on his plants. It was an attack on his dignity, his passion, and, perhaps most importantly, his ability to enjoy a quiet cup of coffee while admiring his rare carnivorous flora. But Jack wasn't the type to wallow in misery. No, Jack was the type to plot. And plot he did. The first step in Jack's plan was simple: paperwork. Lots and lots of paperwork. If there was one thing the HOA loved more than enforcing rules, it was bureaucracy. Jack decided to fight fire with fire, or rather, fight Karen with forms. He began by filing a formal complaint against the HOA for unlawful destruction of property. This wasn't just any complaint. Jack had spent hours researching legal precedents, zoning laws, and environmental regulations. By the time he submitted it, the document was so thick it could have doubled as a doorstop. Karen, of course, dismissed the complaint with her usual air of superiority. "It's within our rights," she said smugly during an impromptu HOA meeting held in her living room, which, Jack noted, had an unapproved chandelier that violated HOA lighting regulations. The greenhouse was a violation of community standards. Jack didn't argue. He simply smiled. A smile that said, "You have no idea what's coming." The second step in Jack's plan involved gathering allies. He started with his neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who had been fined last year for planting daisies instead of HOA-approved tulips in her front yard. Then there was Mr. Patel down the street, who had been forced to repaint his mailbox 3 times because Karen insisted it wasn't the correct shade of beige. Slowly but surely, Jack built a coalition of disgruntled homeowners who were tired of Karen's reign of terror. Together, they started digging, figuratively speaking, though Jack briefly considered literal digging as a way to bury Karen's clipboard. They combed through old HOA records and found dozens of instances where Karen and other board members had violated their own rules. Fences that were too tall, patios that weren't properly screened from public view, and, most damning of all, a shed behind Karen's house that hadn't been approved by the HOA. Jack took this information and compiled it into what he called the Karen Files. It was a dossier so thorough it could have been mistaken for an FBI investigation. Jack even included photos taken by Mrs. Henderson's grandson using a drone, which Karen had previously tried to ban because she claimed it scared her dog. Armed with evidence, Jack moved on to step 3, public humiliation. At the next HOA meeting, which Jack insisted be held at the community center instead of Karen's living room, he presented the Karen Files to the assembled homeowners. The reaction was immediate and glorious. "I knew it!" shouted Mr. Patel, waving a copy of the dossier like it was the Declaration of Independence. "This explains why she never let me build that gazebo," muttered Mrs. Henderson. Karen tried to maintain her composure, but even she couldn't deny the evidence staring her in the face. "These are minor infractions," she said weakly. Jack leaned forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Minor infractions? Like my greenhouse? Or Mrs. Henderson's daisies? Or Mr. Patel's mailbox?" Karen opened her mouth to respond but closed it again when she realized there was no good answer. By this point, Jack could have declared victory and walked away. But he wasn't done yet. Step 4 involved turning Karen's favorite weapon against her: fines. Using the HOA's own bylaws, which he now knew better than anyone, Jack calculated the total amount Karen owed for her various violations. The number was staggering, enough to make Karen's face turn pale as Jack read it aloud. "Of course," Jack said with mock sympathy. "I'm sure you'll pay these fines promptly. After all, rules are rules." Karen resigned from the HOA board that evening. But Jack wasn't satisfied with just dethroning Karen. He wanted to ensure no one else would ever suffer under such tyranny again. So he proposed a series of reforms to make the HOA more transparent and less authoritarian. These included limiting the board's power to approve or deny structures based on personal preference and creating an appeals process for homeowners who felt they'd been treated unfairly. The reforms passed unanimously, except for one vote from Karen, who muttered something about ruining suburban harmony before storming out. With his greenhouse rebuilt and his neighborhood liberated from Karen's iron grip, Jack finally allowed himself to relax. He sat in his backyard one sunny afternoon, sipping coffee while admiring his new Nepenthes Raja, which he'd ordered online using part of his settlement money. Life was good again, and as far as Jack was concerned, revenge had never smelled sweeter or looked greener. Jack's victory over Karen and the HOA was sweet, but it wasn't enough. Sure, he'd exposed Karen's hypocrisy, forced her resignation, and even pushed through reforms to make the HOA less of a suburban dictatorship. But deep down, Jack knew he hadn't truly settled the score. The demolition of his greenhouse still stung, and no amount of legal victories or neighborhood applause could erase the memory of his crushed Nepenthes Raja. Jack wasn't just looking for justice anymore. He wanted poetic revenge. And so began Phase 2 of Jack's master plan, turning his backyard into the ultimate botanical middle finger to the HOA. Step 1 was rebuilding the greenhouse. But Jack wasn't going to settle for a modest structure tucked discreetly into the corner of his yard like before. Oh no, this time Jack wanted something that would make Karen, and anyone else who dared cross him, clutch their pearls in horror. He hired an architect who specialized in statement pieces and commissioned a greenhouse that looked like it belonged in a sci-fi movie. It was sleek, modern, and unapologetically massive, with glass panels that shimmered like diamonds in the sunlight. When construction began, the neighborhood buzzed with curiosity and mild panic. "Is he building an airport terminal?" asked Mrs. Henderson as she peered over the fence. "Looks like an alien spaceship," muttered Mr. Patel. Karen, who still lived in the neighborhood despite her fall from grace, was livid. She stormed over to Jack's house one afternoon and demanded to see his permits. Jack greeted her at the door with a smile so wide it could have been trademarked. "Of course I have permits," he said cheerfully. "I wouldn't want to violate any HOA regulations." Karen narrowed her eyes. "This a monstrosity is going to ruin property values." Jack shrugged innocently. "I think it adds character." Karen stomped off, but Jack knew she wasn't done scheming. By the time the greenhouse was completed, it was a masterpiece of defiance. It towered over every other structure in the neighborhood, its glass walls reflecting sunlight so brightly that Karen had to buy blackout curtains for her living room. Inside, Jack filled it with an eclectic mix of rare and exotic plants. Orchids that bloomed in neon colors, ferns that curled like fractals, and carnivorous plants so large they looked like props from a Jurassic Park sequel. But Jack wasn't content to keep his creation private. No, he wanted everyone to see it, and more importantly, he wanted everyone to know why it existed. Step 2 of Jack's plan involved turning his greenhouse into a community attraction. He announced that he would be hosting weekly open houses where neighbors could tour his collection for free. He even set up a donation box for local environmental charities, just to rub salt in Karen's wounds. The first open house drew a crowd larger than Jack had anticipated. Families showed up with kids who squealed in delight at the Venus flytraps snapping shut on unsuspecting insects. Elderly couples marveled at the orchids and reminisced about their gardening days. Even Mrs. Henderson brought her grandson, who declared Jack's greenhouse cooler than Minecraft. Karen showed up too, though not to admire the plants. She spent most of her visit muttering under her breath and taking photos with her phone, presumably hoping to find some violation she could report to the HOA, which now had limited power thanks to Jack's reforms. But Jack had anticipated this. He'd made sure every detail of his greenhouse complied with HOA regulations, down to the exact shade of beige used for the outdoor trim, a concession he made purely out of spite. Karen left empty-handed and visibly frustrated. As word spread about Jack's greenhouse, it became something of a local sensation. People from neighboring communities started showing up for tours, and soon Jack was fielding requests from schools and gardening clubs who wanted private visits. The donation box overflowed with cash, which Jack used to fund environmental initiatives like planting trees in public parks and restoring local wetlands. Karen tried everything to sabotage him. She filed complaints with city officials, who dismissed them after inspecting Jack's permits, spread rumors about his plants being dangerous, which only made people more curious, and even attempted to rally other homeowners against him, a move that backfired spectacularly when most of them sided with Jack. One day, Karen confronted Jack directly while he was watering his Nepenthes Raja, a new specimen he'd acquired as part of his growing collection. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, gesturing at the greenhouse like it was an affront to humanity itself. "You're turning this neighborhood into a circus." Jack didn't look up from his watering can. "A circus? I prefer botanical paradise." Karen crossed her arms. "You think you've won?" Jack finally met her gaze, his expression calm but undeniably smug. "Karen," he said slowly, savoring every word like it was fine wine, "I didn't just win. I redefined winning." Karen stormed off again, but this time she didn't come back. With Karen effectively neutralized and his greenhouse thriving, Jack felt a sense of closure he hadn't experienced since the demolition debacle began. He'd not only rebuilt what had been destroyed, but turned it into something bigger and better, a symbol of resilience and rebellion wrapped in glass and greenery. And while revenge might not be listed as an official HOA-approved activity, it sure did look good under sunlight streaming through diamond-cut glass panels. Jack's greenhouse had become the crown jewel of the neighborhood, a shimmering monument to botanical excellence and petty revenge. It was impossible to ignore, literally. The sunlight bouncing off its glass panels could probably be seen from space. Tourists started showing up with cameras, snapping selfies in front of the towering structure like it was the Eiffel Tower of suburban America. Jack had achieved what he set out to do. He'd turned his backyard into a masterpiece of defiance, and Karen's reign of HOA terror was officially over. But Jack wasn't done yet. Oh no. If there was one thing Jack had learned from his ordeal, it was that revenge wasn't just about getting even, it was about going above and beyond. And so, Jack decided to take things to the next level. The first step? Naming the greenhouse. Jack wanted something that would really stick it to Karen and the HOA, something that would remind them every single day that they'd messed with the wrong botanist. After much deliberation and a few glasses of wine, Jack settled on the Karen Memorial Greenhouse. He even had a plaque made and installed at the entrance, complete with an inscription that read, "Dedicated to those who believe rules are more important than people." The plaque was an instant hit with visitors. People took photos next to it, shared them on social media, and tagged Karen, who had long since deleted her accounts in shame. Jack couldn't have been happier. Next, Jack decided to host an event, a grand reopening of sorts, to celebrate his greenhouse's success and raise even more money for environmental causes. He called it the Festival of Flora, and it quickly became the talk of the town. There would be plant-themed games, live music, food trucks serving vegan snacks, and even a raffle where the grand prize was a rare orchid grown by Jack himself. Karen, predictably, tried to sabotage the festival by filing noise complaints and claiming the event violated zoning laws. But Jack had anticipated this, because at this point, Karen's antics were as predictable as sunrise. He'd already secured all necessary permits and even invited local officials to attend as VIP guests. Karen's complaints were dismissed faster than you could say Nepenthes Raja. The festival was a roaring success. Hundreds of people showed up, including families from neighboring towns, and even a few reporters who wanted to cover the man who turned HOA tyranny into a tourist attraction. Jack spent most of the day giving tours of his greenhouse, explaining the unique qualities of his plants with all the enthusiasm of someone who just won a Nobel Prize for gardening. At one point during the festival, Jack spotted Karen lurking near the back fence, watching the festivities with an expression that could only be described as sour milk mixed with regret. She looked like she wanted to say something but couldn't muster the courage. Or perhaps she realized there was no point in trying anymore. Jack gave her a cheerful wave and went back to explaining how Venus flytraps use electrical signals to snap shut on their prey. By the end of the day, Jack had raised thousands of dollars for environmental charities and cemented his status as a local legend. People started referring to him as the greenhouse guy, which Jack found both amusing and oddly flattering. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Mrs. Henderson approached him during the festival with tears in her eyes. "Jack," she said, clutching his arm, "you've done something wonderful here. You've shown us all that we don't have to live in fear of people like Karen." Jack smiled warmly. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. But let's be honest. I mostly did this out of spite." Mrs. Henderson laughed harder than she had in years. As the sun set on the festival of flora and guests began heading home with smiles on their faces and raffle prizes in hand, Jack stood in front of his greenhouse and took it all in. The shimmering glass panels reflected the golden hues of twilight, casting an ethereal glow over his backyard. It was beautiful, more beautiful than he could have ever imagined when he first started this journey. Jack knew he'd won, not just against Karen or the HOA, but against every obstacle that had tried to stand in his way. He'd turned destruction into creation, frustration into inspiration, and revenge into something truly spectacular. And while Jack didn't believe in holding grudges, well, not long-term grudges, he couldn't help but feel a small pang of satisfaction knowing that Karen would have to live with this greenhouse towering over her neighborhood for years to come. A constant reminder that sometimes rules are meant to be challenged. So what's the moral of this story? Is it about standing up to bullies? Fighting for your passions? Or maybe just planting more trees? Honestly, Jack didn't care much about morals, he cared about plants. But if there's one thing he hoped people would take away from his experience, it was this: never underestimate a botanist with a grudge. Now, if you enjoyed hearing about how one man turned suburban tyranny into botanical triumph, or if you just want tips on how to grow carnivorous plants without violating HOA regulations, don't forget to like this video. Share it with your friends who've ever dealt with an overzealous HOA board member. Comment below if you've got your own revenge story.